The cargo hauler Meridian had been floating dead in space for 3 weeks, and Danny Wright was still alive inside her, though he had started talking to himself on day 12, and by day 19 he had given names to all the major systems like they were old friends he was visiting in the dark, and the dark was everywhere, because when the reactor died, it took the lights with it, and the heat and the gravity and everything else that made a ship feel like home instead of a tomb. He was in the maintenance crawl space above the cargo bay when the Kethrin warship arrived, and he saw their scanning beams sweep across the hull through the gaps in the metal plating, and he held his breath, even though he knew they could not hear him through the vacuum of space. But old habits were hard to break, and staying quiet had kept him alive more than once in his 42 years of working on ships that other people had given up on. The Kethrins came through the main airlock with their weapons ready and their helmet lights cutting through the darkness like knives, and Danny counted 12 of them in the first wave, and then 6 more behind them, and he knew that was too many for a simple salvage operation, which meant they thought the Meridian was worth taking. And that made sense because even dead, she was a good ship, with strong bones and cargo space that could haul anything legal or otherwise if you knew the right routes. Captain Lisa Monroe stood on the bridge of the Kethrin warship and watched her boarding team enter the human vessel, and she felt the familiar satisfaction of a prize taken without a fight, because humans were weak in her experience, and more interested in their trade agreements than in defending what was theirs, and this dead ship floating alone was proof of that weakness. The Kethrins were tall and gray-skinned with eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not, and they had built an empire across 12 systems by being strong, where others were soft and taking what they needed when negotiation failed. And Captain Monroe had taken many ships in her 30 years of service, and this would be one more trophy to add to her record. Lieutenant Vex led the boarding party through the corridors and reported back that the ship appeared abandoned with no crew and no bodies and no signs of struggle, and everything just left behind, like the humans had simply walked away from their vessel without looking back, and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit, because in Kethrin culture you did not abandon your ship unless you had no other choice, and even then you fought to the last breath. Danny watched them from above and listened to their comm chatter through the emergency receiver he had jury-rigged in the first week, when boredom and fear had driven him to tear apart half the communication systems looking for anything that still worked, and the translator was crude, but it let him understand enough to know they were claiming the Meridian as salvage under their imperial law. He had stayed behind when the crew evacuated because someone needed to manually vent the reactor core, or it would have gone critical and turned the Meridian into an expanding cloud of radioactive debris. And Danny had been the chief engineer for 6 years, and he knew her systems better than anyone else. And the captain had ordered him to leave, but Danny had locked himself in engineering and done what needed to be done. The life pods had launched and left him behind, and the reactor had vented and cooled, and the ship had gone dark, and Danny had survived on emergency rations and recycled water, and the oxygen scrubbers that still worked on battery power in the crew sections, and he had waited for rescue that never came because his distress beacon had failed, and his communications array had been fried in the same power surge that killed the reactor. 19 days alone in the dark teaches a man things about himself, and Danny had learned that he was more stubborn than he thought, and more creative than his engineering scores had suggested, and definitely more angry than he had any right to be, because the Meridian was his ship even if he did not own her, and these aliens with their weapons and their laws were not going to take her without a fight. The Kethrins spread through the ship in teams of 3, and they were professional and methodical, and they secured the bridge and the crew quarters and the cargo bays, and they set up a command post in the main corridor and brought more soldiers across from their warship until Danny counted 38 of them, walking through his ship like they owned it. Captain Monroe declared the Meridian property of the Kethrin Empire, and ordered her engineers to assess the damage and determine how much it would cost to repair the reactor and get the ship operational again. And she was already calculating the profit she would make from selling a human cargo hauler to one of the mining consortiums that operated in the border regions. Danny crawled through the maintenance shafts toward the one place the Kethrins had not checked yet, because their sensors could not penetrate the shielded compartment that held what remained of the Meridian's military past, and he moved slowly and carefully because the metal was cold enough to burn exposed skin, and he had learned that lesson the hard way on day 4. The Meridian had been a military transport during the last war, which had ended 15 years ago when humanity signed peace treaties with most of their neighbors and started converting warships into cargo haulers because peace was more profitable than fighting. And the company that bought the Meridian had removed most of her weapons, but they had been too cheap to strip everything, so they just locked the armory and disabled the firing controls and called it good enough. Danny had spent 3 weeks in the dark thinking about a lot of things, and one of them was how the emergency weapon systems had their own power supply separate from the main reactor, and another was how the firing controls could be bypassed if you knew where to splice the right cables, and he had 3 weeks to figure it out, because there was nothing else to do except wait and think and plan for a rescue that might never come. He reached the armory and used his override codes to open the door, and inside were 2-point defense cannons and 1 railgun, and enough ammunition to make the Kethrans regret boarding his ship. And Danny smiled in the darkness for the first time in 19 days because he finally had a way to fight back. The weapons were old, but they were human-made, which meant they were built to last and simple enough to repair with basic tools. And Danny had been fixing broken things his whole life, so this was just another problem to solve, and he had nothing but time and anger to fuel him. He connected his portable terminal to the weapons control panel and started running diagnostics, and the systems came online one by one with status lights blinking green in the darkness, and Danny felt something like hope mixed with rage building in his chest because the Meridian was not dead yet, and neither was he. The Kethrans were cataloging the cargo when the first railgun shot hit their warship. The railgun shot punched through the Kethran warship's forward shield like it was paper and tore a hole in their port engine array, and alarms screamed across every station on the bridge, and Captain Monroe jumped from her command chair shouting orders that nobody could hear over the chaos because a dead ship was not supposed to shoot back, and her crew was panicking. Danny fired again before they could recover, and this time he aimed for their communications array and watched through the targeting camera as the shot hit exactly where he wanted it, and sparks exploded across the hull of the Kethran ship, and he felt a savage satisfaction that surprised him with its intensity, because he was not a violent man, but 3 weeks alone had changed something inside him. Lieutenant Vex was in the cargo bay when the shooting started, and he grabbed his weapon and started shouting at his soldiers to find whoever was operating the guns and kill them immediately. But the problem was they had no idea where the human was or how many humans there might be because their thermal scanners showed nothing, and their motion detectors were useless in the dead corridors. Danny had brought 2-point defense cannons online along with the main railgun, and it was not much firepower compared to what a real warship could throw around, but it was enough to hurt the Kethrans and make them think twice about taking the Meridian, and that was all he needed right now. He fired the port cannon at their shield generators and watched the energy readings spike and fluctuate on his terminal, and then he fired the starboard cannon at their weapons array, and the Kethrans started shooting back, but their aim was terrible, because they did not want to destroy the Meridian completely, and Danny was using that hesitation against them. Captain Monroe realized her mistake too late, and she knew now that the ship had not been abandoned, and there was at least one human aboard who knew how to use military weapons and who was willing to fight, and she had lost 3 soldiers already. When a bulkhead collapsed from structural damage and she needed to end this quickly before her ship took more damage, she ordered half her boarding party back to make emergency repairs. But Danny had anticipated this move because he had been watching their patterns and learning how they thought, and he sealed the airlocks remotely using the emergency override codes and trapped the Kethran soldiers on the Meridian where they could not help their ship. The trapped soldiers started trying to cut through the airlock doors with their plasma torches, but the Meridian was built with military-grade armor, and it would take them hours to get through, and Danny had no intention of giving them hours because he was already moving through the maintenance tunnels toward his next position. Vex split his remaining soldiers into 3-person teams and ordered them to search every compartment and every tunnel and every crawl space until they found the human, and he was furious now because he was a veteran of dozens of boarding actions, and he had never been humiliated like this by a single enemy. Danny crawled through the ventilation system and listened to their boots clanging on the deck plates below him, and he timed his movements to match theirs, so the sound would cover any noise he made. And he had learned this ship's rhythms over 6 years of service and 3 weeks of darkness, and he knew every sound she made. He reached the environmental control station and accessed the emergency power reserves that he had been saving for exactly this moment, and he brought partial gravity online in Section 3, where most of the Kethran soldiers were searching, and they stumbled and fell as the sudden weight hit them, because they had adapted to 0 gravity and were not ready for the change. The point defense cannons kept firing automatically at pre-programmed targets, and Danny had set them to aim for anything that looked like a sensor array or a weapons system, and the Kethrans were taking damage faster than they could repair it. And Captain Monroe was screaming at her crew to return fire, but they could not get a clean shot without risking their own soldiers. Danny triggered the next surprise and the life support systems came online in Section 5, and warm air started flowing through the corridors, and the temperature rose from -40 to +20 in less than a minute. And the Kethran soldiers, who had been adapted to the cold, started overheating in their armor. Vex ordered his teams to regroup at the main airlock, but Danny had other plans and he sealed the blast doors between sections and separated the Kethran teams from each other. And now they were trapped in small groups scattered throughout the ship and unable to coordinate their movements. One team tried to shoot their way through a blast door, but the ricochets in the confined corridor wounded 2 of them, and they stopped shooting and tried to find another way around. But there was no other way because Danny had mapped every route and blocked every path except the ones he wanted them to take. Captain Monroe made her decision, and it was a brutal one, but she would not lose her warship to a single human on a cargo hauler, and she ordered her weapons officer to charge the main cannon and prepare to destroy the Meridian, along with all the soldiers still trapped aboard. The weapons officer hesitated because those were his friends on that ship, but Monroe repeated the order and he complied because in the Kethran military you followed orders or you faced execution, and he started the charging sequence for the main cannon, which would take 60 seconds to reach full power. Danny saw the power build up on his sensors and he knew what was coming. And he had prepared for this too because he had spent 3 weeks thinking about every possible scenario and how to counter it. And he smiled again in the darkness because they were about to take his bait. He opened the forward cargo bay doors using the manual override, and the massive doors slid apart silently in the vacuum. And the interior of the bay was exposed to space, and Danny had vented specific gases into that bay over the past hour and positioned them exactly where he needed them. The Kethran main cannon fired, and the beam was bright enough to blind sensors across half the system, and it should have cut the Meridian in half, but instead, it passed through the open cargo bay and hit nothing but empty space, and Danny had timed it perfectly. The beam superheated the gases he had vented and created a massive electromagnetic pulse that spread out in all directions like a shockwave, and it ionized everything within 2 light minutes, and every sensor in range registered the burst and logged it and transmitted the data according to their programming. Captain Monroe saw the pulse on her screens and realized she had been tricked, and the human had used her own weapon against her. And she felt something she had not felt in years, which was genuine fear, because this was not how humans were supposed to fight. The electromagnetic pulse was noticed by automated systems far away, and protocols were activated that had been dormant since the last war ended, and a message was sent through the quantum relay network, and somewhere in the depths of space, a warship received new orders and changed course. Danny did not know that help was coming because he was too busy trying to stay alive, and the Kethrans were adapting to his tactics and getting smarter about their search patterns, and he was running out of tricks. Vex had figured out that the human was using the maintenance tunnels, and he ordered his soldiers to seal every access point they found and flush the tunnels with plasma charges, and Danny barely escaped the first blast and felt the heat singe his hair as he crawled faster than he thought possible. He retreated toward engineering because that was the place he knew best and the place where he had one final card to play. And if he was going to die on this ship, he would make sure the Kethrans remembered him forever. The reactor chamber was still, cold and dark, but the containment systems were intact, and Danny started manually overriding the safety protocols one by one. And each override brought him closer to turning the Meridian into a bomb that would take the Kethran warship with her when she exploded. Lieutenant Vex found Danny in the reactor chamber with his hands on the control panel and his finger hovering over commands that would kill everyone on both ships, and the Kethran officer raised his weapon. But Danny did not stop what he was doing, because fear had stopped working on him somewhere around day 15. The translator in Vex's helmet turned his words into human language, and he demanded that Danny surrender immediately. But Danny just looked at him with eyes that had seen too much darkness, and said, "This is my ship, and you want her, then you can have her in pieces." Vex had fought in wars across 3 systems, and he had seen soldiers face death with courage, and he had seen civilians beg for mercy. But he had never seen anything like the cold determination in this human's face, and he understood now that Danny meant every word. The reactor core was still vented and cooling, but the containment systems were active, and Danny had been overriding safety protocols for the past 10 minutes, and each override brought the Meridian closer to a cascade failure that would turn her into a fireball visible from 3 planets. Captain Monroe was screaming orders through the comm system and demanding that Vex capture the human alive, but Vex was staring at Danny and realizing that alive was not an option, because this human would rather die than surrender and would take everyone with him. Danny had configured the reactor to restart without proper coolant circulation and without magnetic containment stabilizers, and without any of the safety systems that normally prevented a runaway chain reaction, and he had about 30 seconds before the point of no return. Vex lowered his weapon slightly because shooting Danny now would not stop the reactor sequence and might actually trigger it faster, and he was trying to think of something to say that would convince this insane human to step away from the controls. The other Kethrin soldiers had caught up and they filled the doorway behind Vex with their weapons ready, but none of them fired because they could see the situation was balanced on a knife edge, and one wrong move would kill them all. Danny's finger was still hovering over the final command, and he was watching Vex and thinking about 3 weeks alone in the dark, and thinking about his ship being stolen, and thinking about how he had saved the Meridian once by venting the reactor, and maybe he could save her again by threatening to destroy her. The standoff lasted 15 seconds that felt like hours, and then every light on the Meridian came back online, and power surged through the systems and external comm channels activated, and the sudden brightness made everyone flinch. A voice echoed through both ships, and it was human and cold, and carried the weight of authority that came from commanding a warship, and it said, "Kethrin vessel, this is the UAS Defender, and you have 30 seconds to release that civilian ship and withdraw." Captain Monroe felt her blood turn to ice because she knew that name, and she knew what kind of ship the Defender was, and she pulled up the sensor data and saw a human destroyer hanging in space 3 kilometers away, with all weapon systems hot and targeting solutions locked. Commander Alan Hayes had been on patrol 3 systems away when the automated distress signal reached his ship, and he had pushed his engines past their safety limits to get here, and now he was looking at a Kethrin warship with its claws in a human civilian vessel, and he was not in a patient mood. The Defender was a modern military ship with railguns and missile batteries and point defense systems that could swat fighters out of space like insects, and she carried a crew of 200 who had trained for combat and were ready to fight. Monroe opened a channel and tried to explain that this was legal salvage under Imperial law, and the ship had been abandoned, and she was claiming it according to regulations that had been established for centuries. Hayes cut her off and said, "The ship has a living crew member aboard, and that makes it an active vessel, and you will release it now, or I will classify this as an act of piracy and respond with appropriate force." Danny heard the exchange from the reactor chamber, and he stopped his override sequence and slumped against the console and felt exhaustion hit him like a physical weight because he had been running on anger and adrenaline for hours, and now that the danger was passing, he could barely stand. Vex was still watching him with his weapon half raised, and the Kethrin lieutenant spoke quietly and said, "You are either the bravest or the most foolish being I have ever encountered." Danny managed a tired smile and said, "Can it be both?" And Vex did something that surprised everyone, including himself, and he laughed because there was something absurd about this whole situation, and this human who had fought 30 soldiers alone with nothing but stubbornness and a dead ship. Captain Monroe was doing calculations in her head and weighing pride against survival, and she had already lost soldiers and taken damage to her ship, and now a human destroyer was threatening to turn her warship into debris if she did not withdraw. She gave the order to retreat, and her crew moved quickly, because they had seen the Defender's weapons targeting them, and they knew what human warships could do when they were angry. Vex received the command through his helmet comm, and he lowered his weapon completely and looked at Danny one more time and said in his own language something that the translator rendered as, "May your ship carry you safely," and then he turned and led his soldiers out of the reactor chamber. The Kethrins moved through the Meridian's corridors toward their airlocks, and they passed through sections where Danny had fought them with lights and gravity, and sealed doors, and every soldier was thinking about how one human had held them off for hours. The boarding umbilicals detached, and the Kethrin warship's engines flared, and Captain Monroe kept her weapons powered down because the Defender was still tracking her, and Commander Hayes had made it clear he would fire if she made any hostile moves. The Kethran ship jumped out of the system, and the space around the meridian was suddenly quiet again, and Danny was still sitting on the floor of the reactor chamber when the Defenders' boarding party arrived. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan led the team, and she found Danny exactly where Vex had left him, and she took one look at his condition and called for medical support immediately because he was dehydrated and exhausted and half-starved. They carried Danny back to the Defender on a stretcher, and he tried to protest because he needed to secure the Meridian's reactor. But Kate told him the reactor was fine, and he had done enough, and now it was time to let someone else take care of things. The medical bay on the Defender was bright and warm and clean, and Danny had forgotten what those things felt like after 3 weeks in the dark, and the doctors checked him over and gave him water and food and told him he was lucky to be alive. Commander Hayes visited after the doctors had finished their initial examination, and he stood beside the bed and looked at Danny with an expression that was hard to read and finally said, "Chief Engineer Wright, you have had quite an ordeal." Danny nodded and said, "I just wanted to keep my ship, and she is a good ship, and it did not seem right to let them have her." Hayes smiled and said, "That is very human of you, and the Meridian's owners are grateful, and so is the Defense Force, and what you did holding off that boarding party alone is going to be talked about for a while." Danny closed his eyes and felt sleep pulling at him, and he asked if the Meridian was okay, and Hayes said she was fine and they were sending a repair crew to fix the reactor and bring her home. The last thing Danny heard before sleep took him was Hayes saying, "You did good, right, and you saved your ship, and that is something to be proud of." In the darkness behind his eyelids, Danny saw the Meridian floating in space, and her lights were on and her engines were warm, and she was alive again, and that was all that mattered. Commander Alan Hayes stood on the bridge of the UAS Defender and watched the Kethran warship disappear into jump space, and he felt the tension drain from his shoulders because a fight had been avoided, but only barely, and wars had started over less. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Paul Griffin, approached and said, "The Meridian is secure, sir, and we have recovered Chief Engineer Wright, and he is in stable condition in medical." Hayes nodded and said, "Good, and send a detail to assess the damage to the Meridian and see what she needs to get home, and also I want a full report on what happened here, because a civilian engineer should not have been able to hold off a Kethran boarding party alone." The Defender had been on routine patrol in the Gamma sector when the automated distress beacon had triggered, and Hayes had almost ignored it, because distress beacons went off all the time for false alarms and minor emergencies. But something about the signal pattern had caught his attention. The signal had been unusual because it was not a standard distress call, but rather an electromagnetic pulse that matched the signature of a weapons discharge, and that meant someone was fighting, and Hayes had decided that was worth investigating. He had pushed the Defender's engines to maximum burn and covered 3 systems in half the time it should have taken, and his crew had gone to battle stations when they detected the Kethran warship and the damaged human vessel. Hayes had seen immediately that the situation was dangerous because the Kethrans had soldiers aboard the Meridian, and their warship was damaged, and someone had been fighting hard enough to create that electromagnetic pulse. He had opened communications with full weapons lock and made it clear he would destroy the Kethran ship if they did not withdraw, and he had meant every word because human civilian vessels were under military protection, and taking one was an act of piracy. Captain Monroe had been smart enough to back down, but Hayes knew she had not been happy about it, and the Kethran Empire would file a formal complaint, and there would be diplomatic meetings, and probably sanctions. But that was a problem for people who wore suits instead of uniforms. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan came to the bridge and reported that Danny was sleeping, and would probably sleep for 12 hours straight because his body was shutting down from exhaustion and stress. Hayes asked how bad his condition was, and Kate said, "He was dehydrated and malnourished and had some minor injuries, but nothing that would not heal. And given that he had been alone in a dead ship for 3 weeks, he was in remarkable shape." The assessment team returned from the Meridian and reported that the reactor could be repaired, but it would take 2 weeks and specialized equipment, and the weapon systems that Danny had activated were old but functional, and he had done an impressive job of bypassing the safety interlocks. Hayes ordered his crew to send a message to the Meridian's company and inform them that their ship was safe and their engineer was alive, and they needed to send a repair crew as soon as possible. The company responded within an hour and said they were sending the repair crew immediately, and they wanted to thank Commander Hayes personally for recovering their vessel and saving their employee. Hayes dismissed the thanks and said he was just doing his job, but privately he was impressed by what Danny had accomplished, because most civilian engineers would have given up or hidden, but Danny had fought back. The story of what happened spread through the Defender's crew within hours because word travels fast on a warship, and everyone wanted to know about the civilian who had held off 30 Kethran soldiers with nothing but old weapons and determination. Hayes went to Medical Bay to check on Danny and found him still sleeping, and the doctor said his vital signs were stable and he would wake up when his body had recovered enough. Hayes looked at the man lying in the bed and thought about the report. He would have to write and how he would explain that a single human civilian had done what a squad of Marines would have struggled to do. The next morning Danny woke up and the first thing he asked was whether the Meridian was okay, and the doctor smiled and said, "Yes, she is fine and you need to eat something." They brought him real food instead of the emergency rations he had been surviving on, and Danny ate slowly because his stomach had shrunk and he could not handle large portions yet, but everything tasted amazing after 3 weeks of protein bars. Commander Hayes visited again in the afternoon and sat beside the bed and asked Danny to tell him exactly what happened from the beginning, and Danny explained about the reactor failure and the evacuation and how he had stayed behind to save the ship. Hayes listened without interrupting, and when Danny described fighting the Kethrans, his expression remained neutral, but his eyes showed respect because he understood what kind of courage that had required. Danny finished his story and said, "I know. I probably broke about 50 regulations when I activated those weapons, but they were taking my ship, and I could not let that happen." Hayes said, "You saved a human vessel from being captured by a foreign military, and that is not breaking regulations, that is defending civilian property, and you will probably get a medal for it." Danny looked uncomfortable and said, "I do not want a medal. I just want to go back to work and forget any of this happened." Hayes smiled and said, "Unfortunately, that is not going to be possible because what you did is already being reported up the chain of command, and the media is going to hear about it, and you are going to be famous for a while." Danny groaned and said, "That is the last thing I want," and Hayes said, "I understand, but you are a hero whether you like it or not, and people need heroes, especially now." The Defender stayed with the Meridian for 3 days until the company repair crew arrived in a tug ship with all the equipment needed to fix the reactor and get the cargo hauler operational again. Danny insisted on going back to the Meridian to supervise the repairs, even though the doctors said he needed more rest, and Hayes allowed it because he understood that some men needed to see their ship was truly safe before they could relax. The repair crew treated Danny like he was made of glass and kept asking if he needed anything, and he kept telling them he was fine and just wanted to help fix the reactor, but they would not let him do any heavy work. The crew chief was a woman named Carol Price who had been fixing ships for 30 years, and she looked at what Danny had accomplished and said, "You kept this reactor from melting down, and then you jury-rigged weapon systems that had been disabled for 15 years, and you did all that in the dark." Danny shrugged and said, "I had a lot of time to think about it," and Carol said, "Thinking about it and actually doing it are two different things, and you should be proud." The repairs took 10 days instead of 2 weeks because the crew worked around the clock, and Danny supervised every step even though he was still recovering, and Kate Sullivan visited every day to make sure he was eating and sleeping. On the final day, Commander Hayes came aboard the Meridian one last time and found Danny on the bridge running system checks, and he said, "The reactor is online and your ship is ready to fly." Danny nodded and said, "Thank you for coming when you did," and Hayes said, "Thank you for holding out until we could get here and not giving up your ship." They shook hands, and Hayes said, "If you ever get tired of the civilian life, the Defense Force could use engineers like you," and Danny smiled and said, "I appreciate that, but I think I will stick with cargo hauling." The Defender departed, and the Meridian fired her engines and began the long journey back to port, and Danny stood on the bridge and felt the familiar vibration of the deck plates under his feet, and knew he was home. 3 months after the incident, the Meridian was back in service hauling cargo between the inner colonies, and Danny Wright had returned to his normal duties as chief engineer, and his crew treated him differently now, though he wished they would not. The company had given him a bonus that was larger than his annual salary, and offered him a promotion to fleet supervisor, which would have meant a desk job at headquarters, but Danny had turned it down because he belonged on a ship, not in an office. His crew had been waiting when the Meridian docked at port, and they had welcomed him back with handshakes and backslaps and questions about what really happened out there in the dark. And Danny had told them the simple version and left out the parts about talking to himself and naming the ship's systems. Captain Helen Cruz had been in command when the reactor failed, and she had given the evacuation order, and she told Danny privately that she was sorry for leaving him behind, and he said, "You did the right thing, and I made my choice, and I would do it again." The younger engineers looked at Danny with something like awe, because he had done what they all hoped they could do if faced with the same situation, and the older engineers nodded with respect, because they understood what it meant to love a ship enough to fight for her. The story had spread beyond the Meridian and beyond the company, and within a week every spacer in 3 systems knew about the engineer who had held off a Kethran boarding party alone and turned a dead cargo hauler into a warship. The media had wanted interviews, and Danny had refused them all until the company made it clear that talking to reporters was part of his job now. So he had done one interview with a major news network and answered their questions as briefly as possible. The interviewer had asked if he was afraid during the fight, and Danny had said yes, but fear stops mattering when someone tries to take your ship. And the interviewer had asked if he would do it again, and Danny had said, "I hope I never have to, but yes, I would." That interview had been broadcast across human space, and millions of people had watched, and the response had been overwhelming. And Danny's comm account had been flooded with messages from strangers thanking him and calling him a hero. But the real impact was happening in places Danny would never see, and among people he would never meet, because the incident had been analyzed by military intelligence services and diplomatic corps and alien governments who were all trying to understand what it meant. The Kethran Empire had issued a formal apology for the misunderstanding and updated their salvage laws to include more careful verification of vessel status before claiming them, and Captain Monroe had been reassigned to a desk position reviewing cargo manifests. Lieutenant Vex had written a detailed report about the engagement, and it had circulated through the Kethran military and become required reading for boarding action training, and in the report he had described humans as deceptively dangerous and never to be underestimated. The report included tactical analysis of how Danny had used the ship's systems against the boarding party, and how he had adapted to their search patterns, and how he had been willing to destroy everything rather than surrender, and the conclusion was that humans were more dangerous than their peaceful reputation suggested. Other alien species took notice of the incident because the Kethrans were considered elite soldiers, and if one human civilian could hold off 30 of them, then what could human military forces do? And that question made a lot of governments nervous. The incident became a case study in human psychology at the Interstellar Relations Institute, and scholars wrote papers analyzing why humans would fight for property with such determination and what that meant for future diplomatic relations. One paper suggested that humans had an unusual attachment to their tools and vessels that went beyond practical value and bordered on emotional bonding, and this made them unpredictable because they would take risks that other species considered irrational. Another paper focused on human adaptability and creativity under pressure, and noted that Danny had used systems in ways they were never designed for, and had found solutions that would not have occurred to most species. Commander Alan Hayes had been promoted to captain and given command of a heavier cruiser, and he kept a picture on his desk of the Meridian floating in space with her lights on, and whenever someone asked about it, he told them the story. Hayes had also written his own report about the incident, and in it he had recommended that the Defense Force establish better communication protocols with civilian vessels and improve emergency response times, because if the Defender had arrived 10 minutes later, Danny might have died. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan had requested a transfer to civilian liaison services because she wanted to work more closely with merchant crews and build bridges between the military and the civilian fleets, and her request had been approved. Kate visited Danny once after the Meridian returned to service and they had coffee in the ship's galley, and she asked him how he was really doing, and he said, "Some nights I still wake up thinking, I am back in the dark, but it gets better." She said, "What you did out there was extraordinary," and he said, "I just did what needed to be done," and she said, "That is what makes it extraordinary, because most people would not have done it." The Meridian's reputation had grown along with Danny's, and other ships would acknowledge her on the comm channels when they passed, and station workers would give her crew priority docking and free drinks at the port bars. Pilots told each other that the Meridian was lucky, and that her crew was blessed, and while Danny did not believe in luck, he did not argue because superstition was part of spacer culture, and you did not mess with what kept people feeling safe. The crew that had evacuated felt guilty about leaving Danny behind, even though they had followed orders and Danny told them repeatedly that they had done nothing wrong, and he had made his own choice. His assistant engineer was a young man named Greg Palmer who asked a lot of questions about the fight, and Danny answered them patiently and tried to make it clear that fighting should always be a last resort, and running away was often the smarter choice. Greg said, "But you did not run away." And Danny said, "I did not have anywhere to run, and that makes the decision easier, and besides, I was too stubborn to let them take my ship without a fight." The Meridian hauled cargo through the shipping lanes, and Danny maintained her systems and kept her running smoothly, and life returned to something like normal except for the occasional reminder that things had changed. Other ships gave them a wider berth than before, and when they docked at stations, the security teams were more respectful, and customs inspectors processed their cargo faster, and it took Danny a while to realize they were treating the Meridian like a military vessel. The word had spread through the non-human species as well, and Danny noticed that alien crews were more cautious around humans now and more polite. And when he asked a Kethran dock worker about it, the alien had said, "Your kind does not surrender," and that is frightening. Danny thought about that conversation a lot because he had not been trying to frighten anyone. He had just been trying to survive and keep his ship, but apparently that was enough to change how an entire species viewed humanity. 6 months after the incident, the Meridian was hauling mining equipment to a colony world when they received a distress call from another human ship that had suffered an engine failure, and Danny told Captain Cruz they should respond. Cruz agreed, and they altered course and found the disabled ship and helped them make repairs, and the other crew thanked them and said they had heard about the Meridian and were glad she had come. Danny realized then that the story of what happened had become bigger than him and bigger than the Meridian, and it had become a symbol of something that humans needed to believe about themselves. They needed to believe that one person could make a difference and that determination mattered, and that giving up was never the only option. And Danny's fight in the darkness had proven all of those things. He stood on the bridge and watched the stars and thought about the 3 weeks he had spent alone and how close he had come to dying, and how the Kethrans had almost taken his ship, and how everything had changed in the moment he decided to fight back. The Meridian hummed around him and her engines pushed them through space, and Danny put his hand on the bulkhead and felt the vibration and knew that he had done the right thing, because this ship was worth fighting for and always would be.